As though there wasn't enough problems in the Russia-Ukraine war, as we're trying desperately to get to a position with the emergence of the Trump administration to try and get a negotiated settlement in the war, in the risk of escalation with the current administration allowing long-range strikes by American weapons and British and French weapons into the Russian mainland and the heartland, which we're dealing with the possibilities of escalating there. Now then, we have just in the last 36 hours or 24 hours, I guess, as an attempt on, not an attempt, an execution and an assassination of a Russian general in Moscow by the Ukrainian side, which unusually they have taken credit for it, and they didn't deny it at all. Said it was supposed to send a message to Russia. We're going to get to what that message may have been intended, and we'll see how that worked out. But there's been some additional information and the developments of where and how this war is going to be settled anyway between the primary people, and that is between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And to try and to make sense of all this and to see, kind of read between the lines about what's really going on here, we have back with us today Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran, and just all-around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
Always appreciate having you here on this because you were so tied into what's going on, and there's probably not a better analyst of combat, because given that you've led troops in high intensity combat in the past and trained a lot of other troops to do the same thing. So it's always great to have you on. And let's just jump right into this. First of all, we keep talking about that things could radically change on January 20th when the Trump administration is inaugurated into power. And I want to show folks a little bit about Trump's thinking, because sometimes we only think about things, at least in the media, in the Western media, about the strategic calculus and, what's good for this side or that side. But Trump is showing his humanity side too, that one of the things that's actually motivating him on wanting to reach this end. And one of the first things he said in a speech, I guess it was a couple of days ago, he explained why he wants to end the war.
Everyone's being killed. It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II. I've had pictures of fields where bodies are lying on top of bodies. Looks like the old pictures of the Civil War, where just bodies are all over. Just if you saw those pictures, you'd feel more strongly about it. It's got to stop.
So it's not just about the deal or what he can strike, but he seems genuinely motivated by the huge number of people that are dying in this.
Well, the good thing is you're not going to hear a stupid statement from President Trump like the ones we've gotten from people like Lindsey Graham, who talk about why we should celebrate the deaths of Russians. Perhaps at some point, the true figures will also be revealed to President Trump, because the Ukrainians have taken losses at a rate of about 6 to 7 for every one Russian soldier that was lost. So these numbers are outrageous, and these piles of dead that he's pointing to are overwhelmingly Ukrainian.
And when you're talking about, what you want to do and why you want to bring something to an end, it just seems to me that there's insufficiently small recognition of the profound price that's being paid by the Ukrainian people. And so many people, like the Lindsey Grahams, like the Jack Keanes, like the General Hodges, they almost seem oblivious to this. I remember some really painful stories from earlier this year when Lindsey Graham went to Ukraine and was, cheerleading them on and saying, yeah, bring more troops in, lower the recruiting age. Apparently, some in the current administration are still trying to pressure Kiev into doing that, oblivious to the cost to them and what this is going to mean going forward. Why do you suppose we don't care anything at all, at least on the official level, about the casualties on the Ukraine side?
Well, Zelensky's meat grinder seems to appeal to a lot of people in Washington, who obviously have no sense whatsoever of what's happening on the battlefield. They don't understand the suffering in war. They don't understand that once you have an advantage over your enemy, which is what the Russians have had for some time now, but particularly at the end, when the front collapses and people are running for their lives, there's no sense of just how much damage you can do at that point. And the Russians have I think on more than one occasion exercised a remarkable restraint, but then they've been compelled for obvious reasons to destroy what's in front of them. I mean, it's a tough position. You'll remember when I came to you after we had blasted through the Republican Guard rear detachment, a couple of things came up. One was that I called for a ceasefire, and a number of people were angry with me because they thought we should just annihilate what was left out in front of us. And there wasn't much there, as you know, Dan. And I said, no, we didn't come here to exterminate people. We didn't come here to exterminate the Iraqi military or anything else. We came here. We've won a battle. Now we need to give the people that are still alive a chance to surrender. You'll remember that.
I do.
But then afterwards, once they did surrender, I also made it clear that we were going to wipe out whatever was still out there. And that's what you put together, the Armageddon strike that we launched from the artillery, because we weren't allowed to advance. But the bottom line is that, this is not a ruthless war of extermination on the Russian side. And the Russians have never wanted that. But sadly, I think there's a lot of evidence that the Ukrainians have taken that position, and we take that position, and we simply do not care what happens to the Ukrainians. They are cannon fodder for the United States, I'm afraid.
And so now then we see, as a result of this significant loss of Ukrainian life, it's having the inexorable result on the battlefield. The only result it can be is the continued and now accelerating advance of the Russians to the west, now at the gates of Pokrovsk, Vasilivka, Novoselica, even in the Kursk area. They continue to shrink that incursion. Really everywhere on the battlefield, you see Russia continues to advance. And now at an accelerating rate. So that brings the question that Trump was also asking at press conference yesterday: are you going to, quote, give away land in exchange for peace? Here's what he said.
Do you believe that Ukraine should cede territory to Russia?
Well, I'm going to let you know that after I have my first meeting. But a lot of that territory, when you look at what's happened to those, I mean, there are cities that there's not a building standing. It's a demolition site. There's not a building standing. So people can't go back to those cities. There's nothing there. It's just rubble.
And I want to look at the premise of the question itself, because I hear it a lot. The impression that there's all this territory that we have in our hands, and we meaning the collective West and Ukraine, and that is Trump going to come in and just hand it over to Russia? I think that that's not the right discussion of even what's at stake here. And I'd like your view on that. And the specific question is, does Trump have land to hand over to Ukraine, or is the Russians going to just take whatever they want on the battlefield, and that's just the reality?
Remember, there are preconditions to the talks from the Russian side. First and foremost, whoever comes to the talks, whether it is Donald Trump or his representatives, have to acknowledge that Ukraine will be neutral. There will be no joining of NATO now or ever. I think probably the Russians are less concerned about NATO the more they see of it, given how poorly the weapon systems have performed, and also the fact that, frankly, in Europe, there is absolutely no appetite whatsoever for war in Ukraine against Russia. But nevertheless, they're going to stand by that first requirement. Ukraine must be neutral. Secondly, that the legitimate control/ownership of the oblasts that have been seized inside Ukraine, which are populated by Russians, as well as Crimea, which already voted itself legally into Russia, these must be recognized as Russian territory. Now, those are the two basic requirements. If we're not willing to do that, it doesn't really make much difference what anyone says, because the Russians are not going to listen to us. I think that's very important. And the second thing, though, that I think that we need to keep in mind is solving the border issue is a matter for Russians and Ukrainians. I know that President Trump thinks of the United States as the great superpower that will come in and divide this child. And he'll sign off on whatever he thinks is appropriate. But the truth is, what we really need to do is simply suspend aid immediately, military aid to Ukraine, and withdraw all of our forces. And you'll have people around Trump say, oh, we can't do that. We're giving up a bargaining chip. Well, that's not really much of a bargaining chip, because as long as we persist in those areas, the Russians are going to move west. And there are talks right now inside the general staff that if a settlement is not reached along the lines that I just described, well, then they march west. And that means all the way to the Polish border and the Romanian border. If that's what we want, then by all means, continue to reject neutrality and the legitimate control of the territories in eastern Ukraine that are populated with Russians to Russia.
And do you think that they can actually make good on that? When you look at how long, for example, it's taken to get even up to Pokrovsk, how long it took to get Avdiivka, Vuhledar, et cetera, over a year in the case of Vuhledar, does Russia have the capacity to make good on that threat?
I think they can, absolutely, because there's nothing west of the Dnieper River to stop them. But is that something we even want to contemplate? It doesn't make any sense. And it's not something the Russians want, because they know the people living west of the Dnieper River are Ukrainians. Right. They don't want to rule Ukrainians. That's like, taking over a country whose entire population is hostile to you, and then you deal with all the consequences. But no, I think the Russians are quite serious. I think we have failed for the last 3 years, Dan, to take them seriously. Yeah, and we continue. I listened to someone earlier today talk about a statement from this former ambassador McFaul suggesting that Ukraine can still win.
Oh my
God. Unless he's smoking crack, there's no excuse for a remarkably stupid comment like that. There is no chance whatsoever. Ukraine is destroyed. Can we rescue Ukraine as a nation state at all is the question now.
Yeah, and that still is very much up and grab, because I think, as you said, if we don't agree when the Trump administration comes in to those terms at the beginning, whether quickly or later, I think that Russia does have the capacity to do that, and we actually have looked at in recent episodes here at the defensive fortifications and why Pokrovsk is so important, because all of these defensive fortifications that have been chewed through, most of which were built in the 2014 and before period, and there's just not much on the other side of Pokrovsk that Russia has been chewing through, and it's entirely conceivable that they could make much more rapid progress on the other side of that if we keep going that far. But interesting, we a lot in the West love to characterize Vladimir Putin as Adolf Hitler, this purely evil person. He's used those terms in the West all the time about Putin. But when you listen to him talking about what the consequence for Ukraine is, it almost seems like he cares about the people.
If they reduce the mobilization age, lower the service age, it will not change the situation on the battlefield like it didn't for Hitler's Germany. But it will be one in a series of crimes they commit against their people. It doesn't protect the interests of the Ukrainian people. Such a decision would only protect the decisions of those who give decisions from abroad. That is the only motivation. Young boys will be herded and sent to be slaughtered. We saw how they are being caught in the streets like stray dogs and sent to face the bullets.
I think you've mentioned before that Putin, while he's against the government in Kiev, that he's not against the people in Ukraine. And as you have rightly pointed out many times, he's been very restrained when it comes to the damage he could have inflicted on the civil population throughout this war, and still has not done it, limiting his targets primarily to military installations or energy infrastructure, which is needed to maybe make their capability to conduct war continue on, to try to degrade that here. But one thing that in the U.S., one of many, I suppose, not only is Vladimir Putin Hitler, but also anything any Russian ever says is untrue. So just categorically just disbelieve anything. And the latest of that is Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, said overnight that he revealed, apparently for the first time, that he's actually put a number on it. He said the number of irretrievable losses for the Ukraine side is now over 1 million. That's killed and disabled to where they can no longer return to the battlefield. And that is a staggering number so far. And I just want to ask you, first of all, do you think that number is close to being right, or is it just Russian propaganda?
I think he's probably underestimating it. I think there are probably 1.4 to 1.5 million that fall into that category that you just described. President Trump talked about this is the worst we've seen since World War II, and he was correct in that sense. But this is more like a World War I battlefield. And again, we go back to this understanding that once you have networked, integrated all of the overhead surveillance, manned, unmanned, sensors from the ground all the way into space, with all of your strike systems, and the Russians historically have always had enormous numbers of strike systems. I'm talking about anything beyond line of sight. Once those are networked, you make it impossible for your enemy, unless the enemy has substantial air and missile defenses, to really move. It makes maneuver almost impossible. That's what the Russians have done in Ukraine. But you have to strip away that air and missile defense, which the Russians have done. We need to understand that. When that battlefield reveals itself and you don't have the capacity to defend yourselves against the air and missile threats that are multiplied by many, many times, 1,000 times what we've seen in the past, then you are in the position the Ukrainians are now. That means that your opponent can maneuver. Your opponent can appear wherever he likes. Your opponent can attack you wherever he likes, but you have no response. Because if you try to respond, if you leave your hole in the ground, or you leave wherever you are concealed, you're going to be destroyed. You know, the Russians, by the way, when Bonaparte faced the Russians finally in Russia itself, he was shocked that the Russians had more artillery than he did, because one of the secrets to his success was extraordinarily well-trained, accurate, and large quantities of artillery. So this is an age-old Russian plus. And that's also what the Germans and their allies found in Russia as the war dragged on. So that's no mystery. And that's not going to change. So hopefully, you know, people will listen to President Trump and understand just how terrible the lethality of this battlefield is. But I don't think they will. I think this is going to go on and on and on until 20 January. And then the real question is, can he rein in this rogue deep state, which consists largely of the intelligence communities and their supporters, and especially on the Hill? Can he rein it in? If he can't rein it in, can he break it and make it responsive to national command authority? I don't know.
Yeah, and man, almost as if right on cue, that was actually where we were going to go next in this, because in light of all the things that you just said there, we have to assume, and I think it's a safe assumption, that behind the headlines and behind the public statements, that whether in the Pentagon or whether in Whitehall or in the halls of power in France, that they're aware of what's actually going on the ground. They can see things. They're aware of these. They know that whatever the real number of Ukraine losses are, I mean, they have to know all that. So they have to know, just no matter what they want to say or what they wish would happen, that there are constraints and limitations physically on the battlefield. And yet, here we have Keir Starmer just yesterday addressing the war in Ukraine, almost completely oblivious to what you just said. But here's the important thing. It's not just his words, but his actions that go along with them.
Absolutely right to say it's a critical period for Ukraine. And I've been here with key NATO allies this morning having a discussion about Ukraine. We're on HMS Iron Duke here, which is in Estonia. We've got troops up the road who are integrated as part of our NATO response. The collective view is very clear. We must put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That means we've got to make sure they have the capability they need, the training they need, the funding that they need, and we must support Ukraine in what they're doing. This is an act of aggression by Russia that's been going on for a very, very long time, so we must stand with Ukraine at this critical period.
Are you comfortable with the assassination, though?
Well, as I say, we must stand with Ukraine. I think that's a developing situation, but this morning's discussion was very clear about the strategic need.
So he referenced there, he was asked about the assassination of the Russian general.